Marcus Reed walked into the cafe the way he walked in every single morning, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Nobody looked at him directly. Nobody said good morning. Nobody dared to strike up even the smallest conversation with the tall, quiet black man who always came alone and always left in silence. Some people whispered that he had once killed someone. Others swore he was a federal agent working undercover. A few were absolutely certain he belonged to some dangerous organization nobody wanted to name out loud. Then, on an ordinary gray afternoon, a woman of Italian descent walked straight toward him, looked him directly in the eyes, and said one single word in Italian. That one word made Marcus freeze in his chair, and it made the entire cafe fall completely silent. The city of Boston in late autumn carried a particular kind of chill, the kind that settled into old brick buildings and lingered in the cracks of cobblestone streets long after the sun had set. Rain fell in thin sheets that afternoon, turning the fallen leaves into a slick golden carpet along the sidewalks of the North End, where an old Italian cafe called Cafe Lucia had stood for nearly 70 years. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where the smell of fresh espresso mixed with the scent of rain on stone, and where a stranger was noticed the second he walked through the door. Marcus Reed had been that stranger for exactly 1 year, 4 months, and 11 days, though nobody in the cafe had ever asked him his name directly. He always sat at the same table by the window, the one with a slight wobble in its left leg, and he always ordered a single espresso, black, no sugar. In his hands, he carried a worn leather notebook, its edges soft from years of handling, and he read from it slowly, as though searching for something he had lost a long time ago. The regulars at Cafe Lucia had built an entire mythology around him without ever exchanging a single word with the man himself. An elderly woman named Margaret Doyle, who had been coming to the cafe since her husband was still alive, insisted that Marcus had once served time in a federal prison for something involving money and powerful people. A younger man named Danny Walsh, who worked construction 2 blocks over, was convinced Marcus was some kind of government operative, maybe CIA, maybe something even more classified, sent to watch the neighborhood for reasons nobody could explain. Still others, gathering in low voices near the pastry counter, whispered that he must be connected to organized crime, that his stillness was the stillness of a man who had done terrible things and made peace with them. The truth, however, was something none of them had ever bothered to ask him directly, and Marcus never offered a single detail. He simply drank his coffee, read his notebook, and left exactly 40 minutes later, every single day, like clockwork. On the particular afternoon this story begins, the bell above the door chimed, and a woman none of the regulars recognized stepped inside, shaking rain from a dark green coat. Her name was Isabella Conti, and she owned a small but celebrated chain of Italian restaurants scattered across 3 states, restaurants known for recipes passed down through 4 generations of her family. She was 36 years old, elegant in a way that seemed effortless, fluent in 4 languages, and carrying, beneath her composed exterior, a family history she rarely spoke of to anyone. Isabella had come to Cafe Lucia that day, simply to meet an old family friend for lunch. But the moment her eyes landed on the man sitting alone by the window, something in her expression shifted. She stood near the counter for a long moment, coffee forgotten in her hand, staring at Marcus with an intensity that seemed to startle even herself. It was as though she was looking at a ghost, or perhaps a memory she had never expected to see walking around in the flesh, and the surprise on her face was unmistakable to anyone who happened to notice. Isabella set her cup down without taking a single sip, and began walking toward Marcus's table, her heels clicking softly against the old wooden floor. Every head in the cafe turned to watch her, and a nervous murmur rippled through the room, because everyone assumed she was about to make a terrible mistake, that she was about to provoke a man nobody understood, and everybody feared. Margaret Doyle actually rose halfway from her seat, as if preparing to intervene, while Danny Walsh set down his fork and watched with wide eyes. But instead of speaking English, instead of offering some polite greeting or awkward apology for staring, Isabella stopped directly in front of Marcus's table, looked into his eyes, and spoke a single word in Italian, soft, but unmistakably clear. Aspetta. Wait. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that cafe had ever witnessed, his composed, unreadable expression cracked completely open. His hands, which had been resting calmly on his notebook, began to tremble. His eyes, usually distant and guarded, filled with something raw and unguarded, something that looked dangerously close to grief. Because that single word, that exact word, spoken in that exact tone, was the last word his fiancée had ever said to him before she died, whispered breathlessly in a hospital corridor in Florence, nearly 6 years earlier. Nobody in the cafe understood what was happening, but everyone could see it, the way a man who had never shown a flicker of emotion suddenly looked as though the ground beneath him had given way. And then, in a voice thick with something between disbelief and desperate hope, Marcus answered her back in fluent, unmistakable Italian, and the entire cafe fell into stunned, absolute silence. Danny Walsh, still frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth, leaned toward Margaret Doyle and whispered that he had never once heard Marcus say more than 2 words to anyone in over a year of watching him from across the room. Margaret shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the 2 figures now seated together, and admitted that whatever theory she had built about Marcus over the past months, none of them had accounted for the possibility of tenderness. A young waitress named Jenny Coyle, who had served Marcus his espresso nearly every single morning, without ever receiving more than a polite nod in return, stood near the counter with a tray forgotten in her hands, watching the scene unfold with quiet astonishment. The rain outside seemed to slow, as though the whole city had paused to take notice of something rare happening inside a small corner cafe in the North End. For a long moment, nobody moved. The espresso machine hissed quietly in the background, and rain continued tapping against the window, but every single person in Cafe Lucia seemed to be holding their breath, watching this impossible scene unfold between 2 strangers, who apparently were not strangers at all. Isabella slowly lowered herself into the empty chair across from Marcus, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. She asked him, still in Italian, how it was possible that he was here, in Boston, sitting in this exact cafe, after all these years of silence. Marcus, his voice low and unsteady, admitted that he had wondered the very same thing about her more times than he could count. The other patrons strained to catch fragments of the conversation, but the language barrier left most of them utterly lost, which only deepened the mystery swirling around the man they thought they already understood. Over the next half hour, Marcus and Isabella spoke entirely in Italian, their voices rising and falling with an emotional current that needed no translation for the people watching. Margaret Doyle leaned toward Danny Walsh and whispered that she had never once seen Marcus speak more than 3 words to anyone, and now here he was, practically pouring his heart out to a woman he had apparently known long before either of them ever set foot in this city. As the conversation continued, Isabella learned something that reshaped everything she thought she knew about her own family's history. Marcus revealed that he had once lived in Florence, working not as a criminal, but as an investigator for the Italian financial police, tracking money laundering networks tied to organized crime families across Europe. Isabella's breath caught in her throat because her own father, Antonio Conti, had once run a struggling family restaurant business that had nearly collapsed under pressure from exactly the kind of criminal network Marcus described. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand that the quiet, feared stranger sitting across from her had once, many years ago, quietly saved her family from ruin without ever once asking for recognition or thanks. Isabella pressed him for details, her hands trembling slightly as the pieces came together in her mind. Marcus explained, carefully and without embellishment, that during his years working financial crimes in Florence, he had uncovered a scheme designed to slowly bleed the Conti family restaurants dry through forced loans and manipulated contracts, all orchestrated by a criminal organization looking to launder money through legitimate businesses. He had built the case quietly, over months, gathering evidence that eventually forced the organization to withdraw entirely, freeing her father's business from a debt that would have destroyed it. He recalled sitting for hours in a cramped office above a bakery near the Santa Croce Basilica, cross-referencing shipment invoices against bank transfers that never quite matched, until a pattern emerged clear enough to bring before a judge. There had been moments, he admitted, when he doubted whether the case would ever hold together, when the pressure from higher authorities to abandon the investigation nearly convinced him to walk away entirely. But something about watching an honest family business slowly suffocated by men who had never worked an honest day in their lives had kept him at his desk long after his colleagues had gone home. But he had never sought credit, never revealed his identity to the family he had protected, because exposure in his line of work meant danger not just for himself, but for everyone connected to the investigation. Isabella sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the fact that a man she had never formally met had shaped the entire course of her family's future. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked with emotion, and she asked him the question that had been forming in her mind since the moment she recognized something familiar in his face. She asked whether he had known her father personally, and Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes distant, before admitting that Antonio Conti had once been the only person in Florence who treated him like more than just a badge in a case file. The memories came back to Marcus in fragments that afternoon, unwelcome, but impossible to hold back any longer, and slowly the room around him seemed to dissolve into the past. He remembered the narrow cobblestone streets of Florence, the golden light falling across the Arno River at dusk, and a young violinist named Elena Marchetti, whose music had first caught his attention on a warm spring evening outside a small chapel near the Ponte Vecchio. Elena had a laugh that seemed to fill entire rooms, dark curls that she never quite managed to tame, and a fierce independence that made her both infuriating and irresistible to a serious, guarded investigator who rarely let anyone close. They had fallen in love slowly, over shared dinners and long walks through the city, over stolen afternoons when Marcus should have been working and Elena should have been rehearsing, and within 2 years they were engaged, planning a small wedding in the countryside outside Florence, where her family had lived for generations. But Marcus's work had made dangerous enemies, powerful men who did not appreciate having their financial networks exposed and dismantled by a determined American investigator. One evening, as Elena walked home from a rehearsal, a car pulled alongside her, and what followed was meant as a warning to Marcus, a brutal message delivered to the person he loved most in the world. Elena survived the initial attack, but succumbed to her injuries 3 days later in a hospital corridor, and the last word she ever spoke to him, whispered through pain and fading consciousness, was that single Italian word, aspetta, wait, as though some part of her believed she might come back to finish what they had started. Marcus never fully recovered from the loss. He resigned from his position within weeks, severed every professional connection he had built in Italy, and left the country entirely, eventually settling in Boston, where nobody knew his name or his history, where he could disappear into anonymity and carry his grief without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. For 6 years, he had built a life defined by careful isolation, convinced that closeness to anyone only invited loss. And until the moment Isabella walked into that cafe and spoke a single familiar word, nobody had ever come close enough to test that conviction. He had rented a small apartment 3 blocks from the harbor, furnished with almost nothing beyond a bed, a desk, and a single framed photograph he kept turned face down in a drawer, unable to look at it directly but unwilling to throw it away. He worked occasional freelance consulting jobs under a different name, careful never to let his skills draw the kind of attention that had once cost him everything he loved. Every evening he walked the same route home along the waterfront, watching the boats settle into the harbor, and every night he told himself that this quiet, uneventful existence was enough, even when some part of him understood it was not. At Café Lucia, the years passed with a strange, unspoken rhythm. Marcus arriving, ordering, reading, and leaving, while the neighborhood around him slowly wove its mythology tighter and tighter around a man who never once corrected any of it. Children who grew up walking past the cafe were warned by their parents to keep their distance, though none of the parents could have explained exactly what danger they imagined he posed. Shop owners along the block nodded politely when he passed, but never lingered in conversation, and even the mail carrier who delivered to his building admitted, once, over drinks with a friend, that something about Marcus's stillness unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of peace, built entirely on distance, and Marcus had convinced himself it was the only peace he still deserved. News of the strange encounter at Cafe Lucia spread through the neighborhood faster than anyone could have predicted, because in a community as tightly woven as the North End, gossip traveled at the speed of curiosity. Someone had captured a blurry video on their phone, showing Marcus speaking fluent Italian, his face uncharacteristically emotional, and within a day, the clip had circulated among dozens of residents who had never once heard him utter more than a few clipped English words. Another video surfaced showing Isabella embracing him briefly as she left the cafe, her hand resting gently on his arm, and speculation exploded across the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had spent over a year constructing elaborate theories about Marcus's criminal past now had new fuel to feed their imaginations, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, more determined to uncover the truth. A freelance journalist named Rebecca Hale, who wrote occasional pieces for a local Boston publication, caught wind of the story and decided there might be something worth investigating beneath the surface. She began digging through old records, making calls to contacts in Italy, and within a week she had uncovered enough fragments of Marcus's past to publish an article that would upend the careful anonymity he had spent 6 years building. The article, published under the headline "The Ghost Investigator," painted Marcus as a mysterious former operative with a shadowy international past, hinting at classified work, dangerous enemies, and a tragedy buried somewhere in his history that the piece could only speculate about. Rebecca Hale had been careful not to fabricate anything outright, but the tone of the article leaned heavily into intrigue, transforming Marcus from a quiet neighborhood fixture into a subject of citywide fascination almost overnight. Reporters began showing up outside Cafe Lucia, hoping to catch a glimpse of the enigmatic man at the center of the story, and strangers who had never spoken to him now approached him on the street, asking invasive questions about his past. Marcus, who had spent years carefully avoiding exactly this kind of attention, felt the familiar instinct to disappear rising within him again, the same instinct that had driven him out of Florence and into the anonymity of Boston in the first place. He stopped coming to the cafe for nearly 2 weeks, retreating into his small apartment, seriously considering whether it was time to pack up and start over somewhere new, somewhere nobody had ever heard his name or seen his face on a phone screen. Isabella refused to let him disappear so easily, however, and she showed up at his apartment unannounced one rainy evening, refusing to leave until he agreed to speak with her. She told him, standing in his doorway with rain dripping from her coat, that she understood exactly what it felt like to have your privacy stripped away by public curiosity, because her own family had endured years of speculation about their connections to organized crime, whispers that had followed the Conti name for decades, despite her father's determined efforts to build something honest and legitimate. She reminded Marcus that hiding had cost him 6 years of his life already, and she asked him, gently but firmly, whether he intended to keep running for the rest of it. Marcus didn't answer that night, but something in her words settled into him, and slowly, over the following weeks, he began stepping back into the world instead of retreating further from it. Isabella made him an offer that surprised even her as she said it aloud. She asked him to help her review the financial operations of her family's restaurant chain, which had been struggling under mounting costs and unexplained losses that nobody in her management team could fully account for. Isabella arrived at her decision slowly, turning the idea over in her mind for nearly a week before she finally worked up the nerve to ask him. She had watched him during their conversations over those first weeks, noticing the way his eyes moved across a room as though cataloging every detail, the way he seemed to notice inconsistencies in casual conversation that most people would never catch. It reminded her of her father, who had once described the man who quietly saved their business as someone with an almost unnatural gift for seeing patterns where everyone else saw only noise. She reasoned that if Marcus possessed even half the skill her father had once described, his help might be the only thing capable of untangling the mess her management team had been quietly struggling with for over a year. Marcus initially refused the offer outright, insisting that his investigative days were behind him and that he had no interest in stepping back into a world of spreadsheets, contracts, and hidden financial schemes. But Isabella persisted, and eventually he agreed to look at just one set of records, purely as a favor, with no formal involvement and no public acknowledgement of his role. What he found within those first few documents troubled him immediately. Small irregularities in supplier contracts, unusual payment patterns routed through shell companies, and management inefficiencies that were quietly draining profits from every restaurant in the chain. Without telling Isabella the full extent of what he was doing, Marcus began working quietly behind the scenes, restructuring payment systems, renegotiating supplier contracts, and tightening internal financial controls across all 12 locations. He worked mostly at night, using his old notebook to track every discrepancy he uncovered, and within 2 months the results were undeniable. Revenue across the Conti restaurant chain increased significantly, waste was eliminated, and employees who had been struggling under inefficient management systems suddenly found their work environment functioning with a precision nobody could quite explain, though a few sharp-eyed managers began to suspect the quiet man who occasionally appeared in Isabella's office late in the evening had something to do with it. Word began spreading among the staff that Marcus, despite his intimidating reputation around the neighborhood, was in fact remarkably brilliant when it came to numbers, contracts, and the kind of financial detail work that made most people's eyes glaze over within minutes. A restaurant manager named Carlos Reyes, who oversaw the flagship location in the North End, began greeting Marcus with genuine warmth whenever he stopped by, a stark contrast to the wary silence that had once defined every interaction between Marcus and the people around him. Slowly, the employees who worked closely with him began treating him not with suspicion, but with something closer to quiet respect, recognizing a sharp, disciplined mind operating beneath his reserved exterior. Isabella watched this transformation with a growing sense of something she hadn't expected to feel again after years of guarding her own heart against disappointment. She found herself looking forward to their evening meetings more than she wanted to admit, finding excuses to extend conversations that could have easily ended in 10 minutes, but instead stretched into hours. Neither of them spoke openly about what was developing between them, but everyone around them, from the staff to the regulars at Café Lucia, could see something shifting in the careful distance Marcus had maintained from the world for so long. Just as the Conti restaurant chain began recovering its footing, a much larger threat emerged, one that would test everything Marcus and Isabella had quietly built together over the previous months. A powerful investment corporation called Holloway Capital Group set its sights on acquiring the Conti chain, seeing an opportunity to absorb a newly profitable business at a fraction of its true value. When Isabella refused their initial offer, Holloway's tactics turned aggressive and manipulative, deploying an army of lawyers, planted media stories questioning the safety and financial stability of Conti restaurants, and pressure campaigns aimed at suppliers and landlords to isolate her business from every side. Fabricated health code complaints appeared in local news outlets, customer traffic dropped sharply within weeks, and several key suppliers, frightened by threats of losing far larger contracts with Holloway-affiliated businesses, quietly severed their relationships with Isabella's restaurants. Watching everything she and her family had built over 4 generations begin to crumble under a coordinated corporate assault, Isabella felt something close to despair for the first time in years, uncertain whether she had the resources or the strength to fight back against an opponent with virtually unlimited financial power. Marcus watched her exhaustion deepen day by day, and something inside him hardened into a familiar determination he hadn't felt since his days chasing financial criminals through the streets of Florence. He made a decision that night, sitting alone in his apartment with Isabella's financial records spread across his kitchen table, that he would not let this happen without a fight. Marcus reached out to old contacts he had spent 6 years avoiding entirely, former colleagues in international financial crime units, who still remembered his reputation as one of the sharpest investigators to ever work a laundering case. Together, working mostly through encrypted channels late into the night, they began pulling apart the layered structure of shell companies and offshore accounts that Holloway Capital Group had used to fund its aggressive acquisition campaign. What Marcus uncovered went far beyond a simple hostile takeover attempt. Buried within Holloway's financial architecture was evidence of a massive money laundering operation, funneling illicit funds through legitimate acquisitions across multiple states, with the Conti restaurant chain representing just one target among dozens. Layer by layer, Marcus documented the connections, tracing suspicious wire transfers through a chain of holding companies registered in 3 different countries, building a case with the same meticulous discipline that had once made him one of the most respected investigators in his field. Within 3 weeks, he had assembled enough evidence to bring the entire operation to the attention of federal financial crime authorities, evidence detailed and precise enough that it could not be dismissed or buried by expensive lawyers. Marcus worked with a focus he hadn't allowed himself to access in years, staying awake until 3 and 4 in the morning, cross-referencing wire transfers, tracing corporate registrations through Delaware and offshore jurisdictions, and rebuilding the same meticulous investigative process that had once made him one of the most feared financial investigators in Europe. Isabella brought him coffee some nights, watching quietly from the doorway as he worked, struck by how different he seemed in these moments. No longer the guarded, distant man from the cafe, but someone fully alive, fully engaged with a purpose he had denied himself for far too long. He explained fragments of what he found as he uncovered them, walking her through shell company structures and layered ownership schemes with a patience she hadn't expected from a man once known only for his silence. Slowly, over those long weeks, Isabella began to understand that the community's old rumors, the whispered stories about danger and violence, had never once come close to describing who Marcus actually was. The federal investigation that followed moved quickly once Marcus's evidence landed on the right desks, and within a month, Holloway Capital Group found itself facing formal hearings before a Congressional Financial Oversight Committee. Marcus was called to testify, a prospect that filled him with a familiar dread. Because testifying meant stepping fully back into the public eye, he had spent 6 years trying to escape. Isabella sat beside him the morning of the hearing, her hand resting firmly over his, reminding him quietly that hiding had never actually protected him from anything. It had only cost him years he could never get back. Inside the crowded hearing room, powerful businessmen who had spent weeks trying to destroy Isabella's family business now found themselves facing a man they had underestimated entirely, a man whose calm, precise testimony methodically dismantled every layer of their carefully constructed financial scheme. Marcus spoke without raising his voice, laying out evidence with the same discipline he had once used to protect the Conti family from an entirely different criminal threat over a decade earlier in Florence. As the hearing progressed, details of Marcus's past began emerging publicly for the first time, details he had spent 6 years carefully burying beneath silence and anonymity. Committee members revealed that Marcus had once received an international commendation for his role in dismantling one of the largest money laundering networks operating across southern Europe, an operation that had protected hundreds of small businesses from exactly the kind of predatory financial crime Holloway Capital Group had attempted to commit. Far from the shadowy criminal figure the neighborhood had once whispered about, Marcus stood revealed as something closer to the opposite, a man who had quietly dedicated his career to protecting ordinary people from exactly the powerful predators trying to destroy Isabella's business now. When the hearing concluded, and the committee announced that Holloway Capital Group would face full federal prosecution for financial crimes spanning multiple states, the room erupted into applause, and several committee members personally approached Marcus to thank him for evidence they described as some of the most thorough and precise they had encountered in years. Isabella watched from the gallery with tears in her eyes, finally seeing the world recognize what she had come to understand months earlier, that the man everyone in her neighborhood had feared without reason was in fact one of the most genuinely honorable people she had ever known. Rebecca Hale, the very journalist whose article had first thrust Marcus back into public attention, sat several rows behind Isabella, scribbling notes for what would become an entirely different kind of story, one that finally told the truth instead of merely hinting at mystery. She would later publish a follow-up piece correcting the record entirely, describing Marcus not as a ghost haunting the edges of the city, but as a quiet protector who had spent his entire career standing between ordinary people and the powerful men who preyed on them. The article spread quickly through Boston, and for the first time, Strangers who recognized Marcus on the street approached him, not with suspicion, but with gratitude, some even thanking him personally for a case they had only just learned he was responsible for. Carlos Reyes, who had grown genuinely fond of Marcus over the months he spent quietly restructuring the flagship restaurant's operations, organized a small gathering among the staff to celebrate the outcome of the hearing, insisting that Marcus deserved recognition even if he never asked for it himself. Marcus arrived reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention, but found himself surprised by how welcome the warmth of the room felt after so many years of deliberate solitude. Employees who had once regarded him with the same wary distance as the rest of the neighborhood now greeted him with genuine affection, several of them admitting openly that they had misjudged him entirely during his first month working alongside them. Isabella watched him move through the room that evening, tentative but unmistakably present, and she felt something settle inside her chest, a quiet certainty that the man across the room was slowly, carefully, learning how to let himself be known again. That evening, away from cameras and reporters, Isabella and Marcus sat together in the quiet dining room of the flagship Conti restaurant, long after the last customers had gone home and the staff had finished closing up for the night. Isabella studied him for a long moment before finally asking the question that had been building inside her for months, asking him gently why he had spent so many years choosing complete solitude over any kind of connection with another person. Marcus was quiet for a long time before answering, his eyes fixed on the candle flickering between them on the table. He admitted, his voice low and unsteady, that he was afraid of loving someone again, terrified that opening his heart to another person meant eventually facing the possibility of losing them the same devastating way he had lost Elena. Isabella reached across the table and took his hand, her expression soft but resolute, and told him that nobody could ever replace Elena, that she had no intention of trying to fill a space that belonged entirely to someone else's memory. She continued, her voice gentle but firm, explaining that she wasn't asking him to forget the past or pretend the pain had never happened, because pain like that never truly disappears. It simply becomes part of who a person is. What she wanted, she told him, was simply the chance to walk forward with him, to build something new together, without erasing anything that had come before. Marcus felt something break open inside his chest that he had spent 6 years holding rigidly closed, a wall he had built brick by brick after standing in that hospital corridor and hearing Elena's final word. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years finally came, quiet and unrestrained, as Isabella moved around the table and wrapped her arms around him without saying another word. For the first time since Florence, Marcus allowed himself to fully feel the weight of everything he had carried alone for so long, and instead of feeling destroyed by it, he felt unexpectedly something close to relief. He told her, once the tears had slowed, about the photograph he still kept turned face down in his apartment drawer, a picture of Elena laughing beside the Arno River on the afternoon he had proposed to her, and admitted that he hadn't been able to look at it directly in over a year. Isabella asked gently whether he might be willing to turn it over now, not to replace the memory, but to finally let it exist alongside whatever came next. Marcus considered the question for a long moment before nodding slowly, admitting that carrying Elena's memory in silence and shame had never actually honored her the way he told himself it did. He realized, sitting there with Isabella's hand still resting in his, that Elena would never have wanted him to spend the rest of his life standing guard over an empty room, refusing every door that opened afterward. In the weeks that followed, Marcus finally returned to his apartment and lifted the photograph from its drawer, setting it upright on a small shelf near his window, where morning light could reach it. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that looking at Elena's face no longer brought only grief, but something gentler, a kind of gratitude for the years they had shared, even though those years had ended far too soon. Isabella never asked him to remove the photograph, understanding instinctively that love, real love, made room for what came before it, rather than demanding its erasure. Their relationship deepened slowly over the following months, built not on the dramatic intensity of their first meeting, but on the quieter, steadier rhythms of shared dinners, long walks along the harbor, and evenings spent working side by side at her restaurant, long after closing. The candle between them burned low, as the two of them sat together in comfortable silence, no longer strangers, no longer separated by fear or grief, simply two people who had found their way to each other through the most unlikely of circumstances. 1 year later, autumn returned to Boston with the same golden light and gentle chill that had marked the beginning of this story, and Cafe Lucia stood exactly as it always had, its wooden tables worn smooth by decades of regulars passing through its doors. Marcus still arrived every morning and still sat at the same table by the window, though now the wobble in its leg had finally been fixed, a small repair he had insisted on making himself. The cafe itself had changed in subtler ways as well. Nobody avoided his gaze anymore. Nobody whispered theories about his past when he walked through the door, and the fear that had once surrounded him like a shadow had long since dissolved into something closer to warmth and familiarity. The owner of the cafe, a gray-haired man named Vincent Russo, who had watched the entire story unfold from behind his espresso counter, now greeted Marcus by name every single morning with a genuine smile, and several regulars made a point of stopping by his table to say hello on their way to their own seats. On this particular morning, the bell above the door chimed, and Isabella walked in, shaking rain from her umbrella, just as she had on that very first day, though this time nobody in the cafe held their breath or exchanged nervous glances. She crossed the room without hesitation and sat down across from Marcus, exactly as she had a year earlier, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now, warm instead of tense, familiar instead of uncertain. Margaret Doyle, still a fixture at her usual corner table, leaned toward them with the easy curiosity of someone who had watched their entire story unfold from the very beginning. She asked, with a knowing smile, how exactly the two of them had first come to know each other, since the story had become something of a neighborhood legend over the past year, retold and embellished countless times by residents who took quiet pride in having witnessed it firsthand. Isabella glanced at Marcus, a soft smile spreading across her face, and then looked back at Margaret before answering with the same single word that had started everything between them so many months before. Aspetta. Wait. Marcus smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that would have been unimaginable from the closed-off stranger who once sat silently at this exact table, and he reached across to take Isabella's hand in his own. He told Margaret, and everyone else who happened to be listening, that on that particular day he had indeed waited, though he hadn't fully understood at the time what exactly he was waiting for. He explained, his voice steady and warm, that he had spent 6 long years believing his capacity for love had died alongside Elena in a hospital corridor in Florence, convinced that solitude was simply the price he owed for having loved someone so deeply and lost her so suddenly. But somehow, against every expectation he had built around himself, he had found a reason to keep going, a reason that walked through the door of this very cafe on a rainy autumn afternoon, and spoke a single word that reopened a heart he thought had closed forever. Isabella squeezed his hand gently, her eyes bright with quiet emotion, and added that sometimes the most important moments in a person's life arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary afternoons in ordinary cafes, waiting only for someone brave enough to speak the right word at exactly the right time. Outside, the rain had softened into a gentle autumn mist, the kind that made the whole city look as though it had been painted in soft shades of gold and gray. And somewhere in the distance, faint and unmistakable, the sound of a violin drifted through the damp morning air, carried perhaps from a nearby music school or a street performer testing an early melody before the day truly began. Marcus and Isabella eventually rose from their table, Isabella slipping her arm through his, the way she had done countless times over the past year, and together they walked out into the mist, leaving behind a cafe that had witnessed the entire quiet, unlikely story of their beginning. Vincent Russo watched them go from behind his counter, shaking his head slowly with the fond amusement of a man who had seen countless stories unfold within his walls, but had never quite seen one like this. As the door closed behind them and the bell chimed softly one last time, the cafe settled back into its familiar morning rhythm, though something about the room felt lighter now, warmer, as though the ghost that had once haunted that corner table had finally, fully come home. Sometimes, The story seemed to whisper into the quiet Boston morning. A single word spoken at exactly the right moment is enough to unlock a door that grief has kept sealed for years, releasing everything a broken heart had been too afraid to feel again.